What do you think is the greatest fear of firefighters? Is it the ferocious flames blazing at thousands of degrees Celsius, seemingly impossible to extinguish? Or the moments when death is just a breath away, everything hanging by a fragile thread between life and death? No, you're mistaken. What terrifies us the most isn't the obvious dangers you can see, it's the deep seated fears within, the ones no one else can see. I'm Max, a veteran firefighter in California, USA, with over 40 years of experience in the field. Throughout that long journey, I've witnessed countless moments you'd only imagine seeing in movies, those breathless seconds teetering on the edge of life and death. But the most haunting part isn't the raging flames or the ever present dangers. It's the feeling of helplessness when there's nothing more you can do. The desperate eyes of those waiting to be saved. The screams for help that echo endlessly in your mind. And sometimes it's the fear that I might not have done enough, that I could have saved more lives if things had gone just a little differently. Today, I want to share with you real stories from our world, the world of firefighters. These stories aren't just about fire and smoke, they are filled with pain, silent sacrifices, and unforgettable lessons. Not to scare you, but to help you understand why we choose to face all of this, and why, despite constantly reaching our limits, we never stop. Take a seat with me and Rainy Diaries as we step into our world. Are you ready? Let's begin. Chapter 1: A Cry for Help in the Wall. It was a gloomy afternoon, with gray clouds blanketing the sky. I was sitting in the station when the fire alarm blared. The dispatcher reported a fire at an abandoned house in the old part of town, where light smoke had been spotted by a passerby. A small fire in such a desolate area usually wasn't a big deal, but my rule was to never take any situation lightly. We boarded the truck, speeding through the empty streets, my mind focused on the task ahead. When we arrived, the house stood silently, as if it had been forgotten for years. Pale gray smoke drifted over the roof, and faint sparks flickered from the second-floor window. There were no onlookers, no panicked screams, just an old, decrepit house hiding an untold story. I signaled my team to begin extinguishing the fire. The blaze wasn't large and was quickly brought under control, but I couldn't shake a feeling of unease, as if something about this place was out of the ordinary, though I couldn't pinpoint what. Once the fire was completely out, we split up to inspect the house. I ascended the staircase to the second floor, where the fire had originated. The old wooden steps creaked underfoot, the atmosphere stifling, not only from the remnants of smoke, but also from the eerie silence enveloping the house. Sometimes you can sense that something is wrong, even without tangible evidence. I carefully checked each room, my flashlight sweeping across soot-stained walls and decayed furniture. When I reached a room at the end of the hallway, I paused. It was a narrow space with 4 bare walls and cracked wooden flooring. My flashlight swept across it, revealing nothing unusual until I heard a sound, a faint, feeble tapping coming from somewhere within the room. I froze, straining to listen. The tapping persisted, as if someone was desperately trying to call for help but lacked the strength to shout. My unease turned into a vague fear. I approached the wall where the sound was coming from and knocked lightly. The sound immediately responded. Someone was inside. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty room. The tapping replied weakly, confirming the presence of someone within. Grabbing my radio, I yelled, "Bring the tools up here now!" My team quickly arrived with crowbars and sledgehammers. We started breaking through the wall with all our might. Each strike felt like a battle against time. Every passing second could mean the difference between life and death for the person inside. When the wall finally gave way, the beam of my flashlight illuminated a small hollow space behind it. Inside was a man, so emaciated that every bone in his body was visible. He was bound tightly, his limbs covered in bruises and cuts. His breathing was shallow, but his wide, terrified eyes told of his ordeal. We hurriedly pulled him out, called an ambulance, and did everything we could to stabilize him. While waiting for the medical team, I asked the man what had happened. His voice was hoarse, but his words sent chills down my spine. He had been kidnapped by a stranger and held captive here for days. In a desperate bid for freedom, he had set the house on fire, hoping someone would notice and rescue him. His eyes met mine, filled with sheer terror, as if reliving the horrors he had endured. After handing the man over to the medical team, I returned to the scene for a closer inspection. In the room where he had been confined, I found numerous disturbing items, ropes, gags, and personal belongings that didn't seem to belong to the victim. A wallet lay on the floor, containing a photo of a young woman and some identification papers. The name on the ID didn't match the man we had just rescued, raising a chilling suspicion that this wasn't the first time the kidnapper had used this house. The police were promptly called to investigate. They combed through every inch of the house, uncovering evidence that painted an even darker picture. The house had been the lair of a deranged individual who had abducted and imprisoned multiple people in the area. Some victims had been identified from the remnants left behind, but others were still unaccounted for. I couldn't begin to imagine the torment endured by those trapped in the darkness behind those walls. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the bound man behind the wall haunted me, along with the unanswered questions. How long had he suffered? How did he summon the will to set the fire, risking his life on the slim chance someone would come? And what would have happened if we hadn't arrived in time? In the following days, the police reported that they had apprehended the perpetrator, a man with a history of severe mental instability and the prime suspect in several disappearances in the area. I felt a sense of relief knowing he wouldn't harm anyone else. But even so, I knew this story would stay with me forever, a stark reminder that not all dangers we face come from flames. Sometimes, the darkest horrors lie within the human heart. Chapter 2, The Cargo Ship Fire. On an autumn day in 1995, the piercing sound of an alarm shattered the stillness of the port as we were dispatched to handle a massive fire on a cargo ship docked nearby. The fire truck roared through the streets, red lights flashing in the night. Through the window, I could see the flickering glow of flames in the distance. Thick black smoke billowed into the sky, rising like a waking monster. When we arrived, the situation was far worse than I had imagined. The massive ship, as long as a towering building floating on water, was engulfed in smoke and fire. Huge shipping containers were stacked on its deck, some already ablaze, their metal frames crackling ominously. The acrid stench of oil and chemicals stung my nostrils, even through my respirator. The captain and crew had been evacuated, but they warned us that many containers held flammable materials and hazardous substances. Our team quickly divided into two groups. One focused on containing the fire from the outside, while the other, including myself, headed into the cargo hold to assess the situation. It was a dangerous mission, but I knew that unless we tackled the fire from within, the ship could turn into a massive bomb, threatening the entire port. The cargo hold was a labyrinth of narrow, dark passageways, and the faint beam of my flashlight barely pierced the suffocating darkness. Every step echoed, the groaning metal adding to the tension. I scanned the containers, searching for signs of fire and checking surface temperatures to avoid triggering an explosion. The fire was spreading faster than we had anticipated, its searing heat licking through rows of cargo, threatening to destroy everything. "Max, we need to cool this area down immediately." Jack, a teammate, yelled over the radio, his voice urgent. I nodded, signaling the team to bring in additional hoses. The scene was a chaotic symphony of shouted commands, crackling flames, and the relentless hiss of water spraying onto the inferno. Then, the unthinkable happened. A sharp, prolonged hissing sound emanated from a nearby container, loud enough to drown out the roar of the fire. I turned my head, my flashlight illuminating the terrifying sight of a bulging container, its metal walls distorting under immense pressure. "Everyone, fall back now!" I shouted. But the words had barely left my mouth when a deafening explosion tore through the hold. A blinding white flash obliterated the darkness, and the shockwave flung me through the air like a rag doll. I felt my body slam into the ship's deck, the impact knocking the wind out of me. All sound vanished in an instant, replaced by a suffocating silence, and then nothing. When I regained consciousness, I had no idea how long I had been out. My head throbbed, my ears rang, and my breaths were shallow, as if my lungs were crying out for air. I tried to move, only to realize I was trapped in a confined space. Around me, charred metal and splintered wood formed an oppressive cocoon, blocking every escape route. The flickering light of the fire seeped through a nearby gap, casting eerie, dancing shadows on the walls of the container. The heat was unbearable, thickening the air and sapping my strength. I knew time was running out. A distant rumble hinted at smaller explosions rippling through the ship, each one a grim reminder that a larger detonation could occur at any moment. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice hoarse from the smoke. No response. Desperately, I rummaged through my rescue kit and found an emergency glow stick. Its pale green light illuminated my grim surroundings. A massive steel beam pinned my leg, making every movement excruciating. I mustered all my strength to push it off, but it was heavier than I anticipated. The pain radiating from my leg was almost unbearable, but I knew stopping wasn't an option. If I didn't escape soon, the fire would finish what the explosion had started. I activated the emergency beacon on my radio, praying someone would hear me. "This is Max. I'm trapped in the cargo hold. I can't get out. The fire is closing in. Please respond." Seconds felt like hours before Jack's voice crackled through the radio, a lifeline amidst the despair. "Max, we're coming for you. Hang on." His words rekindled my determination. I continued to struggle against the steel beam, each attempt accompanied by the searing heat that crept closer. Finally, I heard the sound of running footsteps and saw the blinding beam of a flashlight. "Max, we've got you!" Jack shouted as he and two other teammates reached me. Using a crowbar, they pried the steel beam off my leg and pulled me free. As they lifted me out, the cold night air hit my face, a stark contrast to the inferno I had just escaped. The team carried me onto the ship's deck, where the lights of fire trucks and ambulances pierced the darkness. I lay there, gasping for air, staring up at the star-studded sky. Another explosion rumbled in the distance, but this time, I wasn't afraid. I had survived the grasp of death once more. That night, as I lay in a hospital bed, I couldn't stop replaying those moments of terror on the ship. I realized that being a firefighter isn't just about battling flames. It's about confronting the fragility of life itself. The cargo ship fire wasn't just a haunting memory. It was a stark reminder that every step into danger carries with it the uncertainty of life and death. Chapter 2: The Shadow on the Burning Building. That night, the air was colder than usual, even though it was already March. I had just leaned back on the station chair for a moment of rest when the alarm bell rang out sharply, jolting the entire team awake like a spring. The emergency call came from an old apartment complex on Maple Street, a building that had been in decline for years. "Big fire. Someone's trapped on the top floor." A frantic, panicked voice came through the line. We quickly jumped into the truck, speeding off into the night as the sirens wailed. When we arrived, the scene before me made my heart clench. Flames engulfed the third and fourth floors of the building, and thick black smoke billowed into the sky. A crowd of residents had gathered on the street below, their eyes fixed on the burning complex, but no one dared to get close. Screams and cries echoed all around. I didn't have time to think much. Out of instinct, I directed the team to split into 3 groups. One to focus on extinguishing the fire from outside, one to rescue those on the lower floors, and myself and 2 teammates to head to the top floor, where someone was reportedly trapped. I took the lead, pushing open the heavy main door of the building and stepping inside. The staircase was dark, narrow, and creaky, every step groaning under our weight. The acrid smell of smoke and the oppressive heat from the flames filled the air. Even with my breathing mask on, it was difficult to breathe. Darkness enveloped everything, with only the beam of my flashlight piercing through the dense smoke. Over the radio, I heard a teammate report, "No one on the 3rd floor. We're moving to the 4th. Their voices gave me some reassurance, but I couldn't shake off the unease creeping into my chest. When I reached the 5th floor, I paused to catch my breath. The flames hadn't reached here yet, but the heat and pressure were still palpable. Suddenly, through the dusty window pane of the hallway, I saw a shadow. It was a tall, thin man in a dark coat. He stood motionless by the window, waving at me as if calling for help. I shouted, "Hang on! We're coming for you!" and quickly ran toward the room at the end of the hall, where he was standing. The door to the room was scorched, with the faded number 503 barely visible. I grabbed my axe and smashed the door several times until it broke open, but when I stepped inside, the room was empty. The beam of my flashlight illuminated charred, soot-covered walls, revealing the desolation within. I checked every corner, but there was no one there. Stranger still, the thick layer of dust on the floor showed no footprints, as if the place had been abandoned for years. I shone my flashlight out the window, looking down at the street below, where the crowd was still gathered, but no one was looking up at this floor. I activated my radio and asked my teammates, "Did anyone see the man on the 5th floor?" The response chilled me to the bone. "No, Max. You're the only one up there." A shiver ran down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. We conducted another sweep, confirming that no one else was trapped, and quickly evacuated the building. As I stepped outside, the scent of smoke lingered in my lungs, but the cold night air was a welcome relief. Just as I left the scene, Ryan, a young firefighter on our team, ran up to me, his face pale. He was holding the camera we used to document our rescue operations. "Max, you need to see this," Ryan said, his voice trembling. I took the camera from his hands and rewound the footage of the 5th floor. In the video, when my flashlight beam swept toward the window, the image was unmistakable. The man I had seen earlier. He stood still, waving at me. But what horrified me the most was what appeared in the background, a pair of glowing red eyes flaring up in the darkness behind him. I was speechless, staring at the screen. A mix of helplessness and fear coursed through me, an emotion I had never felt in my entire career. After the fire, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. It felt as if something lingered in that building, something I couldn't explain. Driven by curiosity, I spent weeks digging into the apartment complex's history. What I discovered only deepened my unease. 30 years ago, in that very room, 503, a man had taken his own life after murdering his wife and 2 young children. Before he died, he reportedly set the room on fire, but strangely, the flames never spread beyond its walls, leaving only scorched marks. Since then, the room had remained vacant, though locals claim to have seen a shadowy figure standing by the window at night, always waving as if calling for help. I don't know if the shadow I saw was the spirit of that man or something else entirely. But the glowing red eyes captured in the video haunted me. The gaze of something not of this world. Something that seemed to still cling to that building, silently watching and waiting. Every time I recall that fire, I ask myself, did I do enough to save those who needed help? Or was I just a pawn in a game I could never fully understand? These questions remain unanswered, but they've taught me one thing. Not everything we face in this job can be resolved with courage or skill. Some things must be left in the shadows where they truly belong. Chapter 3: The Man in the Basement. We received an emergency call at noon as the blazing sun beat down on the fire station. On the other end of the line, the dispatcher reported a massive fire at a mansion in the suburbs, with multiple people potentially trapped inside. The urgency in the operator's voice conveyed the gravity of the situation. Without hesitation, I sounded the alarm and our team sped toward the scene. When we arrived, the sprawling mansion was already engulfed in flames. Thick black smoke billowed into the sky and sparks danced through shattered windows. Local residents stood huddled beyond the fence, their faces stricken, pointing at the inferno consuming the house. I shouted out orders, dividing the team. One group was to check the upper floors, another to fight the fire from outside, while I and 2 others headed for the basement, reported as a likely location for trapped individuals. The dense smoke made movement difficult. The flickering beams of our flashlights cut through the darkness and drifting ash. We swept the ground floor but found no one. I descended the stairs to the basement, the sense of unease growing with every step. The narrow staircase reeked of burning, the acrid smell piercing even through my mask. When I reached the cold concrete floor, it became clear that something was amiss. The fire wasn't spreading naturally. It seemed to have originated here. A heavy steel door blocked the way, locked tightly from the outside. I turned to my teammates and signaled, "We need to break it down, quickly." One of them swung a hammer, slamming it into the door. The sound of metal ringing through the stifling air felt like an ominous warning. When the door finally gave way, I froze in place. Before me was a scene I wished I'd never encountered. The flashlight's beam illuminated tools of torment hanging on the walls: knives, scissors, ropes, and handcuffs that gleamed as if freshly used. A large table stood in the center of the room, its surface stained with dried blood. The fire appeared to have started in the corner, where a bookshelf was partially consumed by flames. Whether the fire was an accident or intentional, it was clear this blaze was no coincidence. "What the hell is this place?" one of my teammates whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't respond. My mind raced through possibilities, but they all led to the same horrifying conclusion. This wasn't a typical basement. It was a chamber where a monster disguised as a human had carried out acts too vile to imagine. I approached the table, my eyes catching sight of a partially burned notebook. Flipping through the intact pages, I found chilling entries. A list of names and detailed notes about the days they were processed. My jaw clenched as I fought to keep my composure. "There could still be people trapped down here," I said, my voice hoarse. "Search every corner thoroughly, now!" Behind the partially burned bookshelf, a small, aged door emerged, its surface blackened by smoke. It stood out strangely, as if deliberately concealed to hide something. I signaled to my team, "Check behind that door, something's not right." A teammate swung a hammer, breaking through the rotting wood piece by piece, revealing a small room behind it. I stepped inside, my flashlight illuminating the space. What lay before me was a sight I would never forget. In the charred room, we found the curled-up body of a woman, her entire form blackened by smoke. Though the fire had consumed most of the surroundings, the remnants of bindings on her wrists and ankles were still visible, evidence that she had been restrained. Her face, though no longer intact, bore an expression of terror, as if she had died in unimaginable agony. Suppressing a shiver, I gave orders: photograph the scene and make sure no one touches anything. Call the police immediately. Even though we were firefighters, it was clear to me that this wasn't just a fire. This was the scene of a crime. While my teammates extinguished the last embers, I tried to stay composed as I examined the room more closely. The charred walls bore traces of blood, and on a partially burned table, I found pieces of rope with clear signs of tight knots. It didn't take an expert to realize that this woman hadn't died in the fire. The fire was merely a cover for something far more sinister. After the police arrived to take over the scene, my team and I withdrew. On my way out, I couldn't help but notice a man standing amidst the crowd. He was oddly distinct, wearing a long coat despite the mild weather, and his demeanor was unnervingly calm. His gaze was unlike the others, neither worried nor curious, but cold and calculating, as though he was observing and evaluating us. When our eyes met, a strange feeling rooted me to the spot for a moment. "Max, you okay?" a teammate asked, snapping me back to reality. I nodded, trying to shake off the unease, but I couldn't stop glancing at the man. There was something about him I couldn't ignore, as if he didn't belong in that crowd. A few days later, I received a call from the police. They informed me that the woman's body had undergone forensic analysis, and the results sent chills down my spine. She hadn't died in the fire. She had died before it started. Her wrists and ankles had been tightly bound, her mouth showed signs of prolonged gagging, and the cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation. The fire was set to destroy evidence. "Max, do you remember anything about the man standing near the scene?" a police officer asked during a follow-up. I recounted the details of the man in the long coat, his cold gaze, and the unsettling feeling he gave me. The officer told me they had identified him as the owner of the mansion, the very person who had called in the fire, claiming he had been out shopping when the incident occurred. I was stunned. If he hadn't been home, why had he seemed so calm watching his mansion burn? And why had he shown no grief or concern upon learning someone had been trapped inside? As the police delved deeper, they uncovered horrifying truths. The man had a history of abuse and was suspected of involvement in several local disappearances, though there had never been enough evidence to convict him. His mansion wasn't just a luxurious home. It was a death trap for the unlucky victims who crossed his path. A week later, he was arrested. Even as the police led him away, he remained unnervingly calm, his eyes briefly locking onto mine as if conveying some cryptic message. I couldn't describe his gaze. It was empty, yet calculating. "Did he say anything?" I asked one of the officers escorting him. "Just one thing." You arrived too soon. That single sentence sent a chill down my spine. Despite over 20 years as a firefighter, this was the first time I felt utterly powerless. I couldn't help but wonder how many had been led to that hidden room and how many hadn't had the chance to escape. The fire was extinguished, but its darkness lingered, haunting me every time I closed my eyes. The charred remnants, the woman's body, and his cold gaze, all etched into my memory. They served as a stark reminder that not all dangers come from flames. Sometimes the most terrifying things are those hidden by the fire. Chapter 4: The Child in the Closet. It was a cold winter morning with a gray sky pressing low against the earth. We were hastily sipping coffee in the station's break room when the alarm suddenly blared, shattering the silence. House fire in the west residential area. Someone's trapped inside. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio, fast and firm. The entire team rushed to the fire truck without a word, but the tension was palpable. Fires with people trapped inside, no one wanted to face them, but they were all too common. The fire truck sped through the streets, sirens wailing. I sat in the front seat, staring at the road ahead, but my mind was already at the scene. Residential fires were always complicated. Cramped spaces, flammable furniture, and most critically, the potential for people to be trapped inside. Get us there as fast as you can, I urged the driver, my voice betraying my concern. When we arrived, the two-story house was engulfed in thick black smoke. Bright red flames consumed the ground floor, sparks flying out of shattered windows. I jumped out of the truck, inhaling deeply, despite the acrid smell of burning and the overwhelming heat. A crowd had gathered outside, some shouting and pointing at the house, but none daring to get close. "Is anyone inside?" I yelled toward the crowd, my voice barely carrying over the crackling fire. A man waved frantically, shouting back, "There's a kid I heard crying earlier." My heart sank. A child trapped in a fire was our worst nightmare. I turned to the team. "Jack, you're with me. We'll check upstairs. Everyone else, focus on containing the fire on the ground floor." Without waiting for a reply, I rushed through the front door, the oppressive heat closing in like a wall. The thick smoke made it hard to breathe, even with the oxygen mask on. The flashlight on my helmet pierced through the suffocating darkness, revealing pieces of the burning ceiling crashing down like fragments of hell. "Is anyone here?" I shouted, but there was no response, only the crackling of flames and the ominous creaking of burning wood. We moved toward the staircase, where smoke rose in thick waves. "Careful, the stairs are unstable," Jack called out, but I didn't stop. Every second mattered. It could mean the difference between life and death. At the top of the stairs, I heard a faint sound, weak and irregular, amidst the suffocating silence. It wasn't a clear cry, but more like a broken noise, as if fear had stolen the voice. I signaled for Jack to stay quiet, straining to hear. The sound was coming from a door at the end of the hallway. I ran toward it, my flashlight illuminating a closet door, blackened by smoke. It was slightly ajar, and from inside I could hear trembling breaths. My hand touched the door, the coolness of it a sharp contrast to the searing heat around us. I opened it, and the flashlight beam fell on a small child curled up among the clothes. The child didn't say a word, only stared at me with wide eyes filled with terror and despair. Sweat and tears streaked down the soot-covered face. I knelt down and gently placed a hand on the child's shoulder. "You're going to be okay." "I'm here to help," I said, keeping my voice as calm as possible. The child nodded faintly but remained stiff, as if fear had rooted them in place. I wrapped my protective jacket around the child, lifted them into my arms, and yelled into the radio, "I've found a child! Exiting now!" Jack followed behind, shielding us from falling debris as we made our way out. Stepping outside, the icy winter air hit my face, a stark relief from the oppressive heat inside. I handed the child to the paramedics, trying to reassure them. "You're safe now. Don't be scared anymore." But the child's gaze stayed with me. It wasn't a look of gratitude. It was the look of someone who had faced a terror I couldn't fully comprehend. When everything was under control, I noticed a woman standing amidst the crowd. She looked to be in her early 30s, her face pale, and her anxious eyes never leaving the ambulance carrying the child. "Are you the child's mother?" I asked, stepping closer to her. The woman nodded, but her gaze darted away, her hands twisting together in an unusual display of nervousness. Something was off. As a firefighter, I was used to seeing parents in tears, rushing to embrace their rescued children. But this woman didn't move. Her face showed no relief. Instead, there was an inexplicable tension. When the police arrived at the scene, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling about her behavior. I told them about finding the child in the closet and the peculiar demeanor of the woman. After a swift investigation, the truth began to surface. The child hadn't been trapped in the closet by the fire. It was the mother who had locked them inside before setting the fire herself. The mother was taken to the station for questioning, and eventually she confessed. Her words left me speechless. I didn't want it to live anymore. It's bad luck. Everything terrible started when it was born. Her confession echoed in my mind like thunder across a silent sky. How could a mother think that way about her own child? How could she attempt to take their life and then pretend to be an innocent bystander in the crowd? I stood in silence as the police handcuffed her, overwhelmed with anger and sorrow. That night, back at the station, I couldn't sleep. The image of the child in the closet replayed over and over in my mind, their frightened eyes and haunting silence. I kept wondering, what would have happened if we'd arrived later? How many other children might endure such cruelty from the very person they call mother? As a firefighter, I had always thought of flames as my greatest enemy. But this time, I realized that sometimes the cruelest force isn't the fire, it's the human heart. That story has stayed with me, a constant reminder that not everything we save can truly be healed. Chapter 5: The Sole Survivor. That night, we received an emergency call. A massive fire had broken out at a nursing home on the outskirts of the city, and according to reports, nearly the entire building was engulfed in flames. The alarm blared, and our team sprang into action. I had faced hundreds of fires in my career, but each time, the tension and concern for the people trapped inside were as present as ever. When we arrived, the scene before me was suffocating. The flames had consumed most of the two-story building, with charred walls and thick black smoke spiraling into the sky as if trying to swallow the heavens. The wailing alarms echoed, blending with the chaotic cries of rescue workers battling to take control of the situation. I knew that every second at this moment was a fine line between life and death. I directed the team, splitting them into groups to search different areas of the building. The raging flames seemed intent on driving us back, but we had no choice but to press forward. In the initial moments, we found a few survivors on the lower floor and quickly got them to safety. Yet I knew the chances of finding anyone alive on the upper floor were becoming increasingly slim. As my partner and I moved into the dining area on the second floor, a strange sight met my eyes. Amidst the chaos of smoke and fire, an elderly man sat motionless on an old wooden chair in the corner of the room. He neither screamed for help nor moved in panic. He simply sat there, his cloudy eyes staring into the void, seemingly unaware of the inferno consuming the building around him. I rushed toward him, shouting through my respirator mask, "Sir, I'm here to help you." But he didn't respond or react anyway. When I placed a hand on his shoulder, he turned to look at me, his gaze slow and dreamlike, as if waking from a deep slumber. "We need to get out now," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. But he only shook his head, whispering weakly, "I don't want to leave." I was stunned by his words. There was a profound sadness in his eyes, a sorrow I couldn't touch or understand in that moment. "No, you have to go. I'll get you out safely. Trust me," I insisted, nearly carrying him out of the room. My partner assisted, and together we hurriedly evacuated the man before the flames could spread further. When we got outside, the man didn't express gratitude or relief like the others we had saved. He simply sat on a stretcher, his eyes fixed on the flames devouring the nursing home. "They've all gone," he whispered. I turned to look at him, sensing a weight in his words that I dared not question. Later, as the fire was brought under control and the rescue teams reported back, I learned the truth. All his friends, the people who had lived with him in that nursing home, had not made it out. They had all perished in the fire. He was the sole survivor. I couldn't stop thinking about him after that night. His words echoed in my mind, "I don't want to leave. They've all gone." I realized that when I pulled him out of that building, I hadn't just saved his life. I had taken him away from everything he had left. He had lost his friends, his closest companions, and I had forced him to live with that loss. A week later, I visited the hospital where he was being treated. When I entered his room, he was sitting by the window, staring at the gray sky outside. "Are you feeling all right?" I asked. He turned to look at me, his eyes as sorrowful as they had been that night. "You're the one who saved me, aren't you?" he asked. I nodded. "I don't think I deserve to be saved," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "You didn't deserve to be left in that fire," I replied, trying to reassure him. "You still have family, a chance to keep living." He shook his head, his lips trembling. "My family has been gone for a long time. The people in that nursing home were all I had. You don't understand. I wanted to stay with them, go with them, but you pulled me out." I stood there in silence, guilt welling up inside me. I questioned whether I had done the right thing. Was saving someone only to leave them with unbearable pain truly the right choice? I didn't have an answer. I only knew it was my job to save lives, no matter the circumstances or reasons. Before leaving, I said to him, "I can't change what happened, but I hope you'll find a reason to keep living. Don't let the pain of the past take away your future." He didn't respond, only continued to silently gaze out the window. As I left the room, I felt as though I was carrying the weight of his sorrow with me. That night, I lay awake, thinking about what this job had taken from me, not just my strength, but also the certainty that I was always doing the right thing. I don't know if that man ever overcame his grief, but I do know that his story will haunt me forever. It reminds me that sometimes saving a person isn't just about pulling them out of danger, but about thrusting them into a battle with the wounds of their soul. And that's a battle I cannot fight for them. Chapter 7, The Chemical Plant Explosion. We received the emergency call at midnight, breaking the stillness of the fire station. "Major fire at the chemical plant in the Western Industrial Zone. Explosion risk. Emergency." The dispatcher's voice came through the radio, sharp and urgent. I looked around. No one needed further instruction. The team was already gearing up. In my mind, chemical fires equated to the highest level of danger: toxic smoke, extreme heat, and the looming threat of an explosion. The fire truck sped through the night, its flashing red lights illuminating the road ahead. No one spoke, but the tension in the air was palpable. When we arrived, the scene before us exceeded even my worst expectations. A massive fire roared into the sky, its flames climbing dozens of meters high, painting the night in a sinister red. Black smoke churned heavily, as if it intended to swallow everything in its path. Small explosions rang out continuously, accompanied by the sharp crackling of splitting metal. I took command, ordering the team to suppress the fire from safe zones while checking for anyone trapped inside the plant. We split into smaller groups, each tasked with a specific mission. I, along with 2 teammates, headed for the ground floor, the area closest to the flames. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of chemicals and smoke. The heat was overwhelming, making sweat pour beneath our protective gear. Everything around us, from the floors to the metal walls, emitted high-pitched creaks as they bore the strain of the fire. "Max, there are a lot of chemical barrels here," Jack, my teammate, shouted through his respirator. His flashlight illuminated rows of stacked metal drums, each marked with hazardous symbols. I instantly knew the situation was far worse than I'd anticipated. These barrels weren't just fuel for the flames. They were ticking time bombs that could explode at any moment. "Get the hoses here and keep the fire away from this area," I commanded, my voice straining to rise above the inferno's roar. We began spraying water to cool the barrels, but deep down, I knew we were walking a tightrope. One misstep, and it would all be over. And then the worst happened. A faint hissing sound began, growing louder like a sinister warning from hell. I turned toward the noise, and my heart sank. One of the barrels was deforming under the pressure, its sides bulging as the metal groaned ominously. "Evacuate! Get out now!" I screamed, but before my words had fully left my mouth, a massive explosion erupted. A blinding flash tore through the darkness, followed by a deafening shockwave that flung me through the air. Everything unfolded in an instant. I felt my body slam into a concrete wall, the blast reverberating in my skull. Then, silence and darkness enveloped me. When I came to, everything around me was a haze. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning chemicals, and the intense heat made me feel as though I were submerged in a sea of fire. My head throbbed and my body felt as if it were pinned under a mountain of rubble. I realized I was trapped beneath the wreckage, surrounded by charred metal and crumbled concrete. I tried to move, but one of my legs was caught under a heavy steel beam. Each attempt to lift it sent searing pain shooting through my body, draining my strength. Breathing was agonizing. Each inhalation brought in toxic smoke and dust. "Can anyone hear me?" I shouted, but my voice was little more than a hoarse rasp, lost in the chaos. I scanned the area, desperately searching for something to aid my escape. My flashlight had shattered, leaving only a faint glimmer of light filtering through the debris above. I knew my time was running out. The fire was closing in, and my oxygen supply was dwindling. In those desperate moments, memories of my family, my teammates, and the reasons I chose this career flashed through my mind like a slow-motion reel. I didn't want to die here. I couldn't die here. Summoning every ounce of strength, I pushed against the steel beam, using my entire body to roll free of the rubble. Each movement was a battle between life and death. Finally, I heard a voice. "Max, where are you?" Jack's voice called out, distant but unmistakable. A beacon in the darkness. I tried to shout, but I lacked the strength. Instead, I banged on a nearby piece of metal, the sound echoing faintly. Moments later, a flashlight beam broke through the darkness, and Jack, along with two other teammates, appeared. "Hold on. We'll get you out," Jack yelled. Together, they lifted the steel beam and pulled me free, just as the fire crept closer. As they dragged me outside, the cold night air hit my face, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat inside. I gasped for breath, staring up at the starry sky, overwhelmed with gratitude to be alive. That night, lying in a hospital bed with injuries covering my body, I couldn't escape the harrowing memories of those moments. I had been so close to death, acutely aware of life's fragility with every breath. Each time I closed my eyes, I heard the hiss of the pressurized barrel, the deafening explosion, and the crushing pain of being buried under rubble. I knew I was lucky to survive, but the scars on my mind would never fade. As a firefighter, I had grown accustomed to danger, but the chemical plant explosion was a stark reminder that life could be snatched away in an instant. It showed me that we don't just battle flames, we confront the brutal environments we work in and the ever-present specter of death. Chapter 8: The House Without Fire. In 1993, on a sweltering summer night in a small forest-side town in California, the quiet routine of my team was shattered by an emergency call. It had been a calm night shift until the dispatcher relayed the trembling voice of a young girl. Her sobs, laced with desperate panic, cut through the static. "The house is on fire! The house is on fire! My mom is trapped inside!" Her words were urgent and resolute. Without hesitation, we sounded the alarm, started the fire truck, and raced into the night as fast as we could. When we arrived, an eerie feeling washed over me. The house stood alone at the edge of town, surrounded by the looming shadows of the forest. But instead of raging flames and billowing smoke as I had envisioned, the scene before us was strangely quiet. The house was dark, no lights, no sounds, and most importantly, no sign of fire. My heart sank, unease creeping in. Could we have come to the wrong location? Yet according to the dispatcher, this was the address tied to the emergency call. No one spoke, but the looks we exchanged were filled with silent questions. As team captain, I decided we'd proceed with caution. There could be a smoldering fire inside, or someone might still be trapped, I said, trying to sound resolute despite my unease. We quickly geared up and entered the house. The moment we crossed the threshold, a wave of cold air engulfed me. It wasn't the kind of chill that came from the summer night. It seemed to emanate from the house itself. While the world outside was suffocatingly hot, the frigid air inside made me shiver. The house was pitch black. Flashlights swept across peeling walls and dust-covered floors. Every step echoed in the stillness, each sound heightening the tension. David, a young firefighter on my team, and I took the lead, ascending a creaky staircase to the second floor. Halfway up, I heard a sound. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but David froze, his face pale with fear. It was crying, a faint, trembling sob coming from upstairs. My heart pounded. The voice was unmistakably the same as the girl on the call. We hurried down the hall, following the sound to its source. It led us to a closed wooden door at the end of the corridor. The door was locked from the inside. We called out, but no one responded. With no other option, I ordered David to break it down. With one swing of his axe, the door splintered apart. But instead of finding a frightened girl or a trapped mother, we were met with an empty room. The floor was coated in a thick layer of dust, and there were no signs anyone had been there. My flashlight darted across the room, searching for clues. When the beam stopped on the far wall, a chill ran down my spine. Scrawled across the wall, in what looked like blackened soot, were the words, "Help me." Fear rippled through the team. We divided up and searched every corner of the house, but the place seemed abandoned, as though no one had lived there for years. There was no fire, no smoke, and no signs of life. Once we were sure there was no immediate danger, we left the house, carrying an unshakable sense of unease. On the way back to the station, I contacted the dispatcher to verify the emergency call. The response hit me like a bucket of ice water. No call had been recorded from that address. There was no phone number, no record, nothing. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could such a call leave no trace? Weeks later, I learned more about the house from local residents. Years ago, it had been home to a small family, a mother and her young daughter. One fateful night, a fire broke out, destroying much of the house. The mother perished, while the daughter survived, haunted by grief. A few years later, the girl passed away from depression. Since then, the house had remained abandoned, though some claimed to hear crying coming from it on quiet nights. That night left me with more questions than answers. It made me realize that not every emergency call leads to a real fire. Sometimes we face things beyond explanation, mysteries that defy logic. While that night remains an unresolved chapter in my life, it serves as a haunting reminder that some pain never fades, and that cries from the darkness sometimes just need someone to listen. Chapter 9. The Imposter Rescuer. It was a frigid night, with strong winds sweeping through the abandoned industrial zone, carrying the pungent smell of oil and rust. At 2 a.m., we received an emergency call reporting a massive fire at an old factory that had been out of use for years. I didn't suspect a thing. Fires like this weren't uncommon. Abandoned areas often attracted the homeless or careless individuals burning trash. But this time, I had no idea I was about to face something entirely different. The fire truck sped toward the scene, its red lights casting eerie reflections on the crumbling walls of the factory complex. Flames rose high from the heart of the area, with thick black smoke spiraling upward like a massive pillar. Sparks shot into the air, blending with the dim glow of streetlights, creating a scene both mesmerizing and terrifying. "This is a big one," I said over the radio to my team. "Focus on the central area. Keep the fire from spreading to the old fuel tanks." We quickly divided into teams. One group worked to contain the fire from the outside, while I and two others ventured inside to assess the situation. The factory was a rusty maze of corridors, tanks, and precariously leaning floors. The flames had consumed much of the central area, but something felt off. The fire wasn't spreading randomly as expected. It followed clear paths, like as if it had been deliberately set. As we searched for anyone who might be trapped, a man emerged from the shadows. He was dressed in firefighter gear, a helmet and uniform smudged with soot and ash. He raised a hand in greeting, his face tense but oddly calm. "I'm from another team, sent here to assist," he said, his voice urgent but steady. I nodded, relieved to have extra help. In situations like these, no one questions reinforcements. We need all the hands we can get. "Stick with me. We're checking the west side," I said, leading him through a fiery corridor. The man appeared to be highly skilled. He helped me handle the hose, pointed out critical hotspots, and didn't hesitate to venture into dangerous corners to inspect the fire. I distinctly remember his eyes, focused but devoid of fear. At the time, I thought he was a veteran firefighter, someone who had faced worse situations than this. We pushed deeper into the central area, where the fire raged the fiercest. He paused and pointed at an old fuel tank. "That could blow if we don't cool it down immediately," he said. I signaled my team to bring the hose and followed his advice without question. As we worked, he disappeared from view, saying he was going to check another area. Minutes passed, but he didn't return. I radioed, "Where's the firefighter who was assisting us? Has anyone seen him?" There was no response. A sense of unease began to creep over me. When the fire was under control, I returned to the team to ask about the man. "Where's the guy from the other team?" I asked Jack, who was standing nearby. "What other team?" Jack frowned. "I haven't seen anyone here besides us." A chill ran down my spine. I radioed all the firefighting units in the area, but none reported sending personnel to assist. The man's name and uniform didn't match any records. I returned to the central area to investigate further. In the corridor where the man had disappeared, I found something unusual. A matchbox and a small fuel canister, still reeking of gasoline. My heart raced. The man wasn't a firefighter. He was the one who had started the fire. The police were called immediately. They discovered more evidence pointing to arson: severed electrical wires, strategically placed fuel barrels, and multiple ignition points clearly set with gasoline. The man had infiltrated our team to ensure the fire spread uncontrollably. I couldn't believe I had worked alongside an arsonist, even trusting his advice. Every action he took, from helping us to directing us to the fuel tank, was calculated to mask his true intentions. Thinking back to his expression, I realized it wasn't the gaze of a firefighter battling flames. It was the gaze of someone who relished watching destruction unfold. The police apprehended him after a few days of investigation. He turned out to be a disgruntled former employee of the factory, fired years ago. Consumed by resentment, he had meticulously planned his revenge. Posing as a firefighter allowed him to ensure the blaze wouldn't be extinguished too quickly. That night, as I sat alone at the station, the events replayed in my mind. As a firefighter, I was used to confronting the dangers of fire, an elemental force capable of obliterating everything in its path. But this time, the threat wasn't from the flames. It was from a man who exploited our trust and unity to further his agenda. This incident was a sobering reminder that not everyone who stands among us is there to help, and not all dangers come from fire. Sometimes, the most terrifying threat is the one hiding in plain sight, wearing the guise of a hero. Chapter 10. The Hidden Face. In the early 2000s, the alarm blared just as I set down my cup of coffee. Major fire at the central apartment complex. Risk of spreading. The dispatcher's voice was sharp and urgent over the radio. Quickly, I gathered the team, checked our equipment, and we sped off into the night, sirens slicing through the silence. The central apartment complex was a densely populated area, and the level of urgency couldn't have been higher. Only one thought filled my mind. We had to save everyone. When we arrived, chaos unfolded before us. Flames raged from the fourth floor, their fiery glow reflecting through the building's windows. Thick black smoke billowed out, and residents ran in every direction, shouting for help. "Max, we need to split up," Jack, my teammate, said urgently. I nodded, directing one team to tackle the exterior flames, while I led another group inside to search for those trapped. The building's stairwell was a maze of dense smoke. Flashlights cut through the murk, each step taken cautiously as the heat intensified. The distant roar of flames mixed with the panicked screams of those still inside. When we reached the fourth floor, where the fire burned fiercest, I signaled the team to check every apartment. "Max, this door is locked!" A teammate shouted from the end of the hall. I ran over and saw the blackened, smoke-stained wooden door. Without hesitation, I ordered it to be broken down. With a powerful swing of his rescue axe, David, another firefighter, smashed the door open. As we stepped inside, an unsettling feeling washed over me. The room didn't look like any apartment I'd ever seen. Everything was arranged in an eerie, deliberate manner. The walls were covered with black and white photographs, mostly portraits of different people, men, women, and children. The photos were old, some torn at the edges or singed by fire. A large wooden table stood in the center of the room, covered with strange items: ropes, duct tape, and partially burned notebooks. "What the hell is this?" Jack muttered, his voice low and tense. I approached the table and picked up one of the scorched notebooks. The surviving pages were enough to send chills down my spine. Scribbled across them were detailed accounts of the victims' daily lives, those same people whose faces were plastered across the walls. "Max, look at this," another teammate called out, pointing to a partially burned drawer. Inside, we found a collection of identification cards, driver's licenses, and personal documents belonging to individuals reported missing in the area. "We need to call the police immediately," I said, my voice hoarse with both stress and the acrid smoke. Deep down, I began to realize this fire wasn't an accident. This apartment held horrifying secrets, and the blaze seemed designed to destroy any evidence. As the fire was brought under control and the building deemed safe, the police began their investigation. What they uncovered left us speechless. The tenant of the apartment, a man in his 40s, lived alone and rarely interacted with his neighbors. Records revealed he had worked in maintenance, often traveling between different parts of the city. "Max, what do you make of all this?" Jack asked as we stood outside, watching the police collect evidence. I didn't answer immediately, my eyes fixed on the darkened apartment, now charred and silent. "I don't know," I said after a moment, "but it feels like this fire was meant to hide something. He planned all of this." The next day, police apprehended the man at a bus station. He was carrying a bag filled with suspicious items, including another notebook detailing information about people he had been stalking. During questioning, he coldly confessed to starting the fire, not to escape, but to cleanse his past. The story of this man haunted me for weeks. As a firefighter, I was accustomed to running into the most dangerous fires, but this time the flames weren't the scariest thing. The true horror lay in the man himself. He had lived among us, hidden in plain sight, and it took a raging inferno for his true nature to be revealed. That night, back at the station, I couldn't sleep. The photos, the scribbled notes in the notebooks, and the man's cold, empty gaze replayed in my mind. I couldn't stop wondering, how many people had he harmed? And if it weren't for the fire, would we have ever discovered what he had done? As a firefighter, I had always believed that fire was the most dangerous adversary I'd face. But this time, I realized that sometimes the greatest threat comes from those who hide in the shadows, lurking among us, their true faces concealed, until it's too late. Chapter 11, The Fire That Wouldn't Die. That night, the suburban sky was pitch black, illuminated only by the flashing lights of our fire truck cutting through the darkness. The emergency call came in at midnight, reporting a massive fire at an old warehouse deep in the outskirts. Residents had tried everything to contain the blaze, but it continued to rage uncontrollably. "There's something strange about this fire," the trembling voice on the line had said. "We've never seen anything like it before." I didn't dwell on their words. As a firefighter, I had faced countless dangerous blazes, but this time I had no idea I was walking into a battle beyond my imagination. When we arrived, the scene was nothing short of horrifying. Flames danced violently on the warehouse roof, as though they were alive. Smoke spiraled high into the air, forming a massive black column that blotted out the moonlight. I signaled the team to prepare their equipment and move in to assess the situation. "Split into teams," I ordered over the radio. "Focus on cooling the exterior first, then move toward the center." We began spraying water, but it was as if the flames mocked our efforts. The streams disappeared the moment they touched the fire, leaving no visible effect. The heat was so intense that I felt my skin burning even from a distance. "Max, this fire isn't normal." Jack, one of my teammates, shouted through his mask. I didn't respond, but deep down, I felt it too. We'd fought many fires before, but never one that seemed so defiant, so resistant to everything we threw at it. After nearly 2 hours of struggling, I decided to enter the warehouse to investigate the cause. Inside, the space was a chaotic jumble of charred wooden beams, torn tarps, and burnt crates. Everything was coated in black soot, and the beam of my flashlight barely cut through the thick haze. As I approached the fire's center, something strange caught my eye. Amidst the ashes stood a large frame leaning against a wall. Most of the painting within it had been consumed by the fire, but one corner remained intact, revealing a pair of large, bright eyes that seemed to stare directly at me. "Max, what is it?" Jack's voice came through the radio. I didn't answer immediately, transfixed by the painting. It felt as if something in those eyes was holding me in place, refusing to let go. "I think I found the source," I finally replied, trying to suppress the growing unease in my chest. I stepped closer, intending to take the frame outside for further inspection, but as I touched the scorched wood, a sudden chill engulfed me, an icy coldness that felt out of place amidst the searing heat. And then I felt it. A pull, clear and unmistakable, as if someone had grabbed my shoulder and was trying to drag me back. I spun around, but no one was there. "Max, are you okay?" Jack called out, his voice laced with concern. My heart raced, and I realized my hands were trembling. "I'm fine." It's just something's not right, I replied, my voice hoarse from the smoke. I decided against removing the painting and instead used the camera mounted on my helmet to document it. As I stepped away, the flames seemed to grow fiercer, as though they were guarding something within the warehouse. It took another 2 hours before we finally subdued the fire. Standing outside, watching the last embers die, I felt a wave of relief, but couldn't shake an overwhelming sense of unease. The police arrived soon after to investigate. One officer approached me, holding a folder in his hands. "Max, you won't believe this," he said, his voice low and tense. "This warehouse once belonged to Alan Gray, a renowned painter. He lived here for years before taking his own life 2 decades ago. There's a rumor about his final work, a cursed painting. Supposedly, anyone who tries to possess it meets a tragic end." I didn't say anything, but a cold shiver ran down my spine. I remembered the eyes in the painting, the unnatural chill when I touched the frame, and the invisible force that had pulled me back. It all fit together into a story I didn't want to believe. The police later uncovered a few items amidst the ashes, including the remnants of the painting's frame. However, when they examined it, there was nothing out of the ordinary. I couldn't say whether it was the same painting I had seen, but I knew one thing for certain. Something in that warehouse didn't belong to this world. That night, as I lay in my room, I couldn't stop thinking about the fire. It wasn't like any I'd faced before. It felt alive, with a will of its own and a purpose I couldn't comprehend. I wondered, is it the unknown itself that frightens us, or is it our inability to understand it that makes it truly terrifying? The story of Max comes to an end here. If you love and want to hear more stories about Max, the firefighter who has endured haunting and extraordinary experiences on his journey, let us know. Max and the Rainy Diaries channel are always ready to share more tales about fires that not only threaten lives, but also carry secrets, strange phenomena, and deeply emotional moments. Join us to discover more authentic and equally thrilling stories from Max's world.